There are some stories we come across that stay with us, long after we've finished telling them. The story of Vivienne Crale is one of those. She was 22 years old, had $17 in her coat pocket, and was standing at the edge of a gravel road in northern Ontario when she made the decision that would change everything. She hadn't eaten since the morning before. The October wind off Georgian Bay cut right through her canvas jacket, and the only thing she owned of any real value was a small leather pouch hanging from a cord around her neck, inside of which was a cooper's drawknife, blade no longer than a man's hand, with a handle worn smooth as river driftwood. It had belonged to her teacher. It was the only inheritance she'd received from anyone. We want to tell you how she got there, and what she found when she walked down that gravel road to the end. Vivienne Crale was born in the small town of Ardmoor, Ontario, in a house that smelled of wood smoke and boiled wool. Her father, Raymond Crale, worked seasonally for a logging crew and was away more than he was home. Her mother, Beatrice, kept a kitchen garden and mended other people's clothes for a small income, and in those rare, quiet evenings when Raymond was home and the dishes were done and the fire was banked low, she would read to Vivienne from whatever book she'd borrowed from the church library that week. Novels, travel accounts, once a long illustrated history of the great rivers of Canada. Vivienne remembered the smell of her mother's wool cardigan and the sound of those pages, turning as the clearest, most settled feeling she had ever known. Beatrice died of a ruptured appendix when Vivienne was 9. It was fast and without warning. On a Tuesday she was there, rolling pastry dough and humming to herself. By Friday she was gone. Raymond Crale came home for the funeral and, within 6 weeks, brought with him a woman named Sylvia, who had grown children of her own and who regarded Vivienne with the particular look of a person who has been handed a responsibility they did not ask for. She was not cruel in the way that makes good drama. She was simply indifferent, which is a quieter kind of cruelty and often harder to name. Vivienne found her way, as displaced children often do, to the one place where someone was paying attention to her. That place was the cooperage on the south end of Ardmoor, a low, cedar-sided building that smelled permanently of shaved wood and linseed oil and the warm iron of a forge. The man who ran it was Bertram Hoy, a barrel maker in his late 60s, widower, with a reputation for being difficult and a reality of being simply precise. He had no patience for sloppiness, in wood or in people, but he had a sharp eye for effort. The first time Vivienne appeared at his open workshop door, she was 11 years old and asking if he needed someone to sweep. He handed her a broom without speaking. She swept. She came back the next day, and the day after that. After 2 weeks, he began to explain what he was doing, not asking whether she wanted to know, simply narrating as he worked. This is a howl plane. This is how you read the stave for green wood versus seasoned. This is how a bilge hoop is driven without splitting the wood beneath it. She listened with the absolute attention of someone who has been starved for exactly this kind of instruction. He never once asked if she was keeping up. He assumed she was, and so she did. By the time Vivienne was 15, she could hoop a medium barrel from scratch, working slowly but accurately. By 17, she was fast enough to be genuinely useful. Bertram never paid her wages, but he fed her lunch every day she came in, which Vivienne understood was its own kind of payment, and on her 18th birthday, he set his good drawknife on the bench beside her, the one with the applewood handles his own teacher had given him, and said, without ceremony, "You'll get more use out of it than I will." She carried it with her from that day forward. Bertram Hoy died in the spring of the following year, quietly, in his sleep, leaving the cooperage to a nephew who arrived from Sudbury, looked at the place for 2 days, and sold it for lumber value. By that time, Vivienne had already understood she needed to find work elsewhere, and she spent the summer doing repairs at a farm supply warehouse on the edge of town, which paid little but kept her fed. Then in September, Raymond Crale and Sylvia told her she was to move out. Her father said it in the way he said most hard things, standing in the kitchen doorway with his eyes on a point just past her shoulder, the words coming out rehearsed and quick. They needed the room. She was grown now. It was time. Sylvia was behind him somewhere, invisible, silent, having already made the decision, and now merely allowing it to be announced. Vivienne looked at her father for a long moment, waiting to see if he would meet her eyes. He did not. She packed that night. She took her clothes, her mother's copy of a novel she had read until the spine cracked, her savings, $17, and the leather pouch with Bertram's drawknife. She left before they woke. She walked north and then west. She wasn't heading anywhere in particular, only away. She had heard from a man at the warehouse about a stretch of small lakeside settlements north of Owen Sound, where there was work sometimes. Boat repair, dock building, seasonal labor. She wasn't afraid of physical work. That was the one thing she was sure of. It was on that gravel road on the third day of walking that she saw the sign. It was hand-lettered on a piece of plywood and nailed to a cedar post at the entrance to a long, overgrown lane. Cabin, 5 acres, Lakeshore $7. Atty, General Store, Ardmoor. Someone had added below it, in a different, sloppier hand. Nobody wants it, don't bother. $17. Vivienne stood on that gravel road and looked at the sign for a long time. The wind off the lake was cold, her feet hurt. She turned and walked in the direction the sign pointed toward Ardmoor. Abner Pollitt ran the general store out of a converted house at the edge of a community of maybe 30 year-round residents and a handful of summer cottages now shuttered for the season. He was a compact, weathered man in his 70s, with the slow movements of someone who has decided to stop hurrying. He looked at Vivienne over the counter without the wariness she had expected and said, simply, "You're here about the Fenwick place." "Tell me about it," she said. He exhaled slowly. August Fenwick built it in 1951. Him and his wife, Lena. Good cabin, pine logs, stone foundation right on the water. He was a boat builder, knew what he was doing. They had a son, Leo, who was the light of the place. Leo went to university in Toronto, engineering, came back one summer and drowned in the lake. They never found out exactly how. August searched for months. That man spent his last good years dragging that lake. Lena left eventually. Couldn't stay. August kept on alone for a few more years. When he finally went to the county home, there was nobody to tend the place. Been sitting since 1979. That's 11 years. Why hasn't anyone bought it? Pollitt set his glasses on the counter. 3 families tried. None stayed past one winter. Some said it was the cold off the lake, the isolation. Others, he paused, choosing his words, said it felt wrong, like the place was still waiting for something. People in town call it the Fenwick cabin still. Not with warmth. He looked at her. $17 won't even cover a decent meal in the city. No, Vivienne agreed. But it might cover a cabin. He looked at her for a long moment, then he reached under the counter for a deed book. The lane was half a kilometer long, and so overgrown the birch saplings had met in the middle. She walked it in the early afternoon light, pushing branches back. Then the trees opened, and she saw the lake, Georgian Bay, steel gray and enormous under the October sky, and in front of it, set on a low rise above the waterline, the cabin. The log walls were solid, the chinking crumbled away in places but the logs themselves still sound. The stone foundation held, each course level and tight. August Fenwick's boatbuilder's hands had known how to fit things that needed to last. The roof had a bad spot on the northwest corner. 2 courses of cedar shingles rotted through, and one of the 2 windows on the lake-facing wall was broken. The glass scattered inward. The door was swollen in its frame, but it opened. Inside was the smell of cold and time. A stone hearth occupied most of the north wall, the firebox intact, the flue. She tested it with a candle she'd kept in her coat pocket, drawing well. The floor was wide pine plank, dry and solid except for 2 boards near the door that had warped. A sleeping loft sat above the back half of the cabin, accessible by a ladder whose rungs were still firm. There was a wood stove connected to a second flue pipe through the rear wall, well positioned for cooking. There were shelves. There was a wooden workbench under the broken window, and on it, coated in dust, were August Fenwick's tools, a drawknife of his own, a set of chisels, a wooden block plane, a draw shave. Whoever had handled his affairs had simply left them. Vivienne stood in the quiet for a long time. Other people had come here and felt something wrong. She felt a different thing, the particular quality of a place that has been built with great care and then abandoned to grief. She knew that quality. It was not malevolence, it was longing. The cabin was not cursed, it was heartbroken. She ran her hand along the edge of the workbench and felt the way August Fenwick had planed it smooth. You don't do that for a workbench unless you care about the thing you're building. You don't lay a stone foundation to that level of precision unless you want the thing to last for someone else. She thought about Bertram Hoy, who had planed his own workbench that same careful way, who had left his tools to her. She opened the leather pouch around her neck and set her drawknife on the bench beside August's. 2 tools, 2 makers, 1 bench. She would stay. The first 2 weeks were about survival before anything else. She patched the roof with materials she'd found stacked in the lean-to behind the cabin. Half a bundle of cedar shingles, dry and still good. She used Bertram's drawknife to trim the warped shingles to fit, and worked her way across the damaged section. 1 course at a time, the October cold making her hands clumsy until they warmed with the work. She refitted the broken window, using a pane of old glass she found in the lean-to, wrapped in burlap, as if someone had been waiting for someone to need it. She split firewood from a stand of dead birch at the edge of the clearing. The axe she found in the lean-to needed a new handle, which she cut from a straight-grain piece of ash, fitted it, and drove the wedge herself. She caulked the worst of the chinking gaps with a mixture of clay from the lakeshore and dried grass packed in with a trowel. It was imperfect and would need doing properly in the spring, but it cut the wind by half. She had enough wood stacked inside by the end of the second week to last until December if she was careful. She was always careful. Abner Pollitt at the general store had no work to offer her, but he knew who might. He sent her to see Willa Saab, who ran the boat livery at the end of the public dock. Willa was a tall woman in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of unheard authority that comes from decades of knowing what you're doing. She looked at Vivienne the same way Bertram Hoy had looked at her all those years ago, seeing something, measuring it. "Coopering," Willa said. "That's barrels and casks and any tight cooperage, water barrels, storage barrels. I can do repair work on anything wood-staved." Willa walked her around to the back of the livery to a row of old dock bumpers and mooring posts, a capsized rowboat with 3 broken ribs, cedar canoe with a staved-in gunwale. "If you can fix those, I've got more, I pay fair." Vivienne looked at the work. She nodded. She worked at the livery 3 mornings a week through the first weeks of November, walking the lane in the gray early light and arriving at the dock as Willa was opening up. The work was good. She had to adapt her coopering skills to boat work, which shared the same logic of curved wood and precise joinery, but had its own grain and rhythm. Willa didn't talk much while they worked, but she paid attention, and she corrected Vivienne once or twice with the terse, useful precision of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. On the 3rd Friday, Willa made tea on the small wood stove in the back of the livery and set a mug in front of Vivienne without asking. "You're staying at the Fenwick place," Willa said. "Yes." She drank her tea. "August Fenwick taught me to repair a clinker hull when I was 19, before I knew anything." She said it the way people say things they've been thinking about for a while. Then she didn't say anything else about it. But on her way out that afternoon, Vivienne noticed that a bag had been left on the step of the lean-to behind the cabin, a cloth bag containing a tin of tea, a jar of rendered fat, and a folded piece of wax paper with 4 thick slices of bread inside. No note. She knew whose it was. Willa began appearing at the cabin on Saturdays, ostensibly to check on the dock bumpers she'd dropped off for repair. She never came empty-handed. Sometimes it was food. Once it was a pair of good wool socks. Once a jar of birch bark ash she said was useful for treating wood. Their conversations were short and practical, but something accumulated in them over time, a warmth that neither of them named but both understood. Vivienne fixed the dock bumpers. She fixed the broken ribs in the rowboat, using strips of ash she'd cut and steamed in a tin she fashioned from the cabin's old coal scuttle. She refit the gunwale on the cedar canoe. Word moved through Ardmoor as it moves through small communities, not loudly, not with announcement, but with the slow reliability of water-finding level. The Fenwick place had smoke coming from its chimney each morning. The lane had been cleared. There was someone there who could fix things. An older man named Reuben Stamp came by one afternoon with a wooden bucket that had dried out and lost its seal, the staves separating at the hoops. He set it on the ground outside the cabin door and said he'd heard she might be able to save it. She could, and did, soaking the staves overnight in the lake to swell the wood back, redriving the hoops, and returning it to him 2 days later holding water as well as it ever had. He said nothing particular in thanks, but he left a side of salt pork on her step the following week, wrapped in brown paper. This was the language of the place. Not words, but things left at doors. It was in late November, on a morning when the first real snow was coming down in long, slow curtains over the lake, that Vivienne found the box. She had been meaning since her first week in the cabin to clear out the space beneath the sleeping loft, where old crates and a collapsed shelf had accumulated years of mouse nests and debris. She'd been working through it methodically, and on this morning she pulled out the last crate, heavier than it looked, and found that beneath it, the wide plank floor had been modified. One board, shorter than the others, had been fitted with a recessed finger pull of bent copper wire. It was deliberate. She would not have noticed it if she hadn't been clearing the floor on her hands and knees in the low winter light. She hooked her finger in the wire and lifted. Below was a shallow space, maybe 8 inches deep, lined with oilcloth. Inside was a flat wooden box, the kind a man might keep a set of good knives in, latched with a small brass hook. She brought it to the table and opened it. Inside, fitted into a bed of green wool, was a set of boat builder's marking tools. A mortise gauge, a fine bevel, a cutting awl, a marking knife, each one of exceptional quality, the handles turned from what she recognized as walnut, oiled and still perfect. Beneath the tools, folded carefully, was a piece of heavy paper covered in close, even handwriting, and beneath the paper, held flat by the tools, was a photograph. A woman and a boy, standing on this dock in summer, the boy maybe 15, laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, Lena and Leo, July 1966. She unfolded the letter. It was written in a careful slanted hand, a man's hand accustomed to precision. To whoever opens this box. My name is August Fenwick. I built this cabin in 1951 with my wife Lena, and I built it to last, which I believe it has. I am writing this in 1981, the last winter I will spend here. My hands are no longer good for the kind of work this place requires, and I am going to the county home in Owen Sound in the spring. I have no family left to leave this to. My son Leo died in 1973, and his mother left not long after. I do not blame her. I could not carry it either in the end. These tools were Leo's. I gave them to him when he turned 16, thinking he would become a builder like me. He did not. He chose engineering instead, which was fine, which was right. But he used them sometimes, here at this bench, on weekends when he came home. He had good hands even if he chose to use them differently. I am leaving these here because I cannot take them to a room at the county home, and I cannot sell them. They are his. But I do not want them to rot in an empty cabin. So I am leaving them for whoever comes next, with this request. Use them. Use them with the knowledge that they were bought with care for a boy who is gone, and that caring for tools is a way of caring for the person who owned them. I have also left, in this box, the deed to one half of the far woodlot, the eastern 20 acres, registered separately from the cabin. It is not much, but good timber on it, worth something if you need it. I've paid the taxes forward 10 years. It is yours, with the tools, with the cabin, with whatever years this place has left in it. Make something here. That is all I ask. And if you find a way to be happy in this valley, please be happy. Leo would have wanted that. He was that kind of boy. August Fenwick, March 1981. Vivienne sat for a long time at the table while the snow came down over the lake. She thought about a man who had built a workbench so carefully that its edge was still smooth after 40 years, who had fitted stones so truly that their courses hadn't shifted in 4 decades of frost and thaw, who had planed and fitted and built a place that was meant to outlast him, and then had outlasted his reason for being there, and still had kept faith with the thing he'd made, making sure, even in leaving, that the tools were oiled, the deed was paid forward, the instructions were written down. A man who could not be happy in the place he had built, but who could not bring himself to let the place go to ruin. She thought about Bertram Hoy, who had left her his drawknife and his knowledge, and nothing else because he had nothing else to leave, who had seen something in an 11-year-old girl with a broom and had quietly, persistently, given her everything he knew. Both men, she thought. Both men had loved forward, into the future, into someone they would never meet. She folded the letter and set it carefully back in the box. She picked up the photograph of Lena and Leo, studied the boy's laughing face, the way he stood with his weight easy on one foot, entirely at home on that dock. She set the photo back. Then she went to the small shelf above the hearth, the one she'd fixed and leveled in her first week, and she set 2 things on it. Bertram's drawknife in its leather pouch, and Leo's marking gauge, lifted from the wool in the box, its walnut handle dark and perfect. She put the rest of the tools back in the box, and the box on the workbench where she could reach them. That evening, she lit the fire in the hearth, the good solid stone hearth that August Fenwick had built, and sat with her back against the log wall, listening to the lake. Georgian Bay in a November storm is not a quiet sound. It is enormous and low and continuous, like something breathing. She had been afraid of it in her first weeks. Now it sounded like company. She thought about what August Fenwick had asked. Make something here. That was all. She had already begun. Winter settled over Ardmoor with the particular intensity of Georgian Bay winters. The wind driving off the open water and the snow coming in sideways from the northwest, but the cabin held. The chinking she'd packed in October did its work. The wood stove was efficient, and the hearth radiated heat long after the fire banked down. She slept in the loft under 2 wool blankets and woke each morning to a cabin that was, if not warm, then manageable, alive in the way that only a well-built and well-tended place can be. Willa Saab came by on Christmas morning with a covered dish, a proper roast, with carrots and potatoes, and they ate at the cabin table and talked for 2 hours about boats, about wood, about the way Georgian Bay behaved in different seasons. Willa had grown up 15 kilometers north of Ardmoor and had never lived anywhere else. She knew this country the way Vivienne knew barrel staves, from the inside out, by feel and memory. She told Vivienne about the summer fishing runs and the spring breakup, and the one year, 1977, when the ice on the bay had grown for 3 days straight before it went. Before she left, Willa stood for a moment looking at the shelf above the hearth, the drawknife pouch, the marking gauge. She didn't say anything about them. But on her way out the door, she stopped and said, without turning, "August would have liked you." It was the most she ever said about it. In January, Reuben Stamp came by with his son-in-law, a younger man named Callum, who was putting up a woodshed and had gotten the roof framing wrong and didn't know why it was racking. Vivienne went out with them, looked at it, found the problem, a missing knee brace on the northeast corner, and showed Callum how to cut and fit one. He was a quick learner, attentive in the way Vivienne had been attentive at Bertram's bench, and she felt something unfamiliar in the act of showing him. A quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with completing the work herself. After that, people came with questions. Not many, and not often, but enough. A broken axle on a hay wagon, a dock section that had heaved over the winter, a rain barrel that had split along a stave. Vivienne fixed what she could, taught what she knew, and accepted what was offered in return. Food, usually, or a load of firewood, once a good wool hat that fit perfectly, and which she wore for the rest of the winter. She was not lonely. She had not expected that. She had expected to be lonely. But the cabin was full, in its way, full of the presence of the people who had built it, and loved it, and grieved in it, and full of the steadier, quieter presence of the work she did there each day. Bertram had taught her that work was its own company, that the particular silence of a workshop, the silence you earn by focusing completely on a thing, was a different quality of silence than emptiness. She had known it in his cooperage. She knew it here. When the thaw came in April, she walked down to the lake in the early morning, when the ice was just off the water, and the bay was the color of old pewter in the gray light. She took the photograph of Leo from the box. She'd kept it on the shelf through the winter, propped against the wall, and she walked to the end of the dock and stood there for a while, listening to the water. The bay was calm that morning, which was unusual. The surface moved in long, slow rolls, unhurried. She didn't say anything aloud. She sent a thought toward the water, toward whatever was still there of a boy named Leo who had stood on this dock in the summer of 1966 and laughed at something outside the frame. Then she put the photograph back in her coat pocket to return to the box, to the shelf, where it belonged. She had not exercised anything. That was not how it worked, and she knew it. August Fenwick's grief had soaked into the log walls of this place the way linseed oil soaks into old wood. It was part of the structure now, invisible but present, making the thing stronger than it would otherwise be. You don't remove that. You build around it. You let it hold you up. By spring, the Ardmoor community had quietly stopped calling the place the Fenwick Cabin. They didn't rename it formally. It just happened, the way things shift in small places. One day Abner Pollitt said, "Up at Vivienne's," when giving directions, and after that so did everyone else. She had a name in this place. She had a bench to work at, tools in her hands, fire in the hearth that August Fenwick had built. She had Willa Saab coming on Saturdays, Reuben Stamp leaving things at her door, young Callum stopping by with questions and a willingness to learn. She had the bay outside her window, which was never the same twice. Gray one day, blue the next, sometimes in a high summer light almost green. She had, though she would not have called it this yet, a life. On the shelf above the hearth, Bertram Hoy's drawknife and Leo Fenwick's marking gauge stood side by side, two tools from two makers who had poured what they knew into the people who came after them. She had been given skills and purpose, both of them delivered quietly, without ceremony, by people who had simply seen her and decided to trust her. She had been 22 years old with $17 in her pocket and nowhere to go. And she had found, at the end of an overgrown lane beside a bay, that in winter sounded like something breathing, exactly what she needed. Not what she expected. Not what she would have asked for. What she needed. We leave you with what August Fenwick asked, and what Vivienne Crale answered with her hands and her days. Make something. From what you have, in the place you've been given, and if you find a way to be happy there, please be happy. What is the most unexpected place, or the most unexpected person, that turned out to hold something you needed?